I'd like to introduce you to Robert Gardner. Robert.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Come up on stage. Robert's the founder of Rebalance Earth. He'll be making some remarks, and then I'll be asking you a few questions, and then I'll open up for some questions for you. So you've got the Slido. If you want to pose some questions, over to you. Thank you very much. Robert.
Good morning, everyone. I've got a confession to make, which is I'm a geographer. And for 25 years, I pretended I wasn't. I started in investment banking, and it wasn't the right subject to be studying back then. But I'm also a pension consultant. I've been an asset owner, and I'm now trying to invest in nature. And so if I can extend risk and price, I think the next thing is, why will someone pay for this? And when someone will pay for this, how can we make it into an asset class? I want to begin with a question. Does anyone know where this is? Yeah, Los Angeles, November 2019, courtesy of Ridley Scott. Now, Ridley Scott was painting a dystopian future, and the inspiration for this scene came from the ICI chemical factory in Teesside, just down from Redcar, which he used to walk to when he went to school every morning. And the flaring from the ICI factory is what gave him the inspiration for that opening scene. Now, what's that got to do with nature? Well, in the world I come from, pension funds, which is defined benefit, local government pension funds, DC, and wealth, we care about two things: financial returns and a world worth living in. And so when it comes to making nature an investable asset class, unlocking that dam, and by the way, that dam is big, it's £5 trillion. We need to answer two questions. How do I make money? And what impact does it have? So over the next 10 minutes, I want to try and unpack that. Why will pension funds invest? Where does the cash come from? How do I get companies to pay for this risk? And then finally, what are the impacts? But I think we know what the impacts are. So this is one of my favorite nature-based solutions, a great example of a rate of return from investing in nature, from a company you wouldn't suspect would invest in nature-based solutions. So this is Dow Chemical, who 28 years ago needed to build a new water processing plant. So option one was to spend $40 million to build a treatment plant that would clean 20 million litres of water a day, and all the associated energy costs and chemical costs on an ongoing basis. But instead, they restored this wetland in Texas. Total cost, $1.4 million. This wetland saves them $10 million a year. The net present value on that trade is $280 million. That's an internal rate of return, an important number for pension funds, of 18%. I get 4% on my HSBC account, so 18% is a pretty damn good example. And they aren't taking into account the carbon sequestration, the biodiversity benefits, or all the social co-benefits of this. Now, why is it that more people aren't seeing this opportunity to invest in what I call nature as business critical infrastructure? Because too often, the answer to the solution is to build more stuff. Now, I know we all know about climate change and how bad it is. I think two things to flag. On Thursday, there's a webinar from the FCA about climate adaptation. But just to give you the takeaway, A is aim for 1.5 degrees C. We're at about 1.25. Let's start making sure that when we think, if you're a bank, an asset manager, insurer, are you ready for 1.5 degrees C and the adaptation that comes with that? B, budget for 2. And C, contingency for 2.5 by 2030. Now, there are people who know far more about this than I do, but the key thing is every 1 degree C it increases in temperature is a 7% increase in moisture in the air. And what happens, this is a great chart from the Met Office showing dispersion of rainfall in the UK. Obviously, we're getting more rainfall, but we get more intense rainfall. And also, we get more periods of lower rainfall. And last week and for the last 2 weeks, we've all been experiencing the damage that means. So that's the kind of climate physical risk. And I want to make it real because this is the Shell garage in Carlisle off the M6. Has anyone been there? It's no longer a Shell garage. It was one of Shell's most profitable petrol stations. You can just imagine you're driving down from Scotland, down the M6, you pull over, fill up your car, buy some snacks, making tons of money. It flooded in 2005, and then it flooded again in 2015 and 16. Irreparable damage to their tanks. Not only did Shell lose all of the revenue and profit associated with that store, but that is now a stranded asset. You can look it up. It is basically no longer being used. It is just an asset that is dead. Now, even more damaging was the McVitie's factory. So if any of you like McVitie's biscuits, the damage was so bad to McVitie's in 2015 and 16 that RSA had to pay out £50 million in insurance, and they had to declare it. And on the day they declared it, their share price actually fell. So I want you to be under no illusion that climate risk causes actual loss of revenues and profits and stranded assets. The problem is no one knows it. CDP put out a report, and basically, if you think about all of the nature risks, water is the #1 risk. It impacts 7 to 9% of GDP. And yet 2/3 of financial institutions, banks, asset managers, and insurers really understand or have assessed their water risks. And only 1% of financial institutions have even set targets about water security. So when you talk about risk, the issue is that no one can even see this risk. And guess what? The Environment Agency spent £38 million building some amazing flood defences in Carlisle to withstand a 1 in 170-year flood. Guess what? Storm Desmond, waste of time, waste of space. And the problem is that we don't see the solution. It stood right in front of us. It's called nature. We don't need to build stuff out of cement and steel. And here's the crazy thing. Only 3% of our rivers in the UK are in what's called dynamic equilibrium. So 97% of our rivers have been straightened, canalized, changed, which completely changed the flow of water off our land, let alone the way we farm our land, the way our soil health is, and the state of our peatlands. And so again, I want to go just down the road to Manchester. They've got a water quality problem. That treatment needs £200 million in new investments. And we have a flooding problem. And so United Utilities has to build some storm overflows. In fact, it needs to build so much water storage, it needs to build 35 towers worth of water storage. More cement, more steel, more embodied carbon. And yet, just up the road in Dovestone, we have a fantastic peat blog, a blanket peat blog. Anyway,
We know you mean.
it's such a, if you don't know anything about sphagnum moss, it is such an incredible piece of nature tech. Each amount of sphagnum moss can store 20 times its weight in water. And people normally talk about peatland and carbon sequestration. But the point being is that right now, the solution that everyone is looking at is building more water storage. But the answer again is in front of us with nature. But why aren't we doing it? Well, we've taken a different approach because most people often come to us at Rebalance Earth and say, hey, I've got some land, I've restored it. Do you want to buy it? And I want to say, you said from fields to trade. I think we need to go from pain to gain. So our starting point is to start with the catchments with the most at risk. So this is an example of Plymouth, which we just signed an MOU with. And you can see that we've tried to identify what are all the flood risks on the River Plym, how many buildings, how many substations. By the way, people think flooding is flooding of their asset. If your substation floods, you have no electricity. If your roads flood, you can't get in. No one's talking about it. But last week off the M6, 2 prisons couldn't get their staff in and out of their prisons. It's going to have material knock-on effects to that. And so our starting point is not to start with nature counterintuitively, but to start with high value catchments and then to work backwards and say, what are the nature catchment, whole of catchment restoration opportunities that we can do? It might be peatland, it might be river restoration, it might be paying farmers to farm differently, improve their soil quality. This tributary, by the way, is a tributary that feeds into the River Plym, nice and straight, not how it's meant to be. So Richard talked about the wall of money. How do we get £100 billion? We need $700 billion a year globally to solve this crisis. In the UK, it's about £10 billion. That's £100 billion over the next 10 years. That's a huge amount of money. But the good news is behind that dam is £5 trillion worth of pension and wealth assets. And even better, that number is going to double to 10 trillion by 2035. And so my point to a pension fund is for every pound that you have, if you just took 2p, made a 2% allocation to nature as an asset class in the same way that you invest in real estate or infrastructure, if I can reframe nature as business critical infrastructure, and if I can show you, you can get a rate of return because those companies in Plymouth are going to pay to reduce the risk of not being able to operate like Shell and McVitie's, all of a sudden I get paid for nature and I get to achieve the two things I need to do: create a financial return and ultimately a world worth living in. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Robert, thank you so much. Really, I hope you understand why I wanted Robert to